If you spend enough time running defensive drills on the firing line, you figure out pretty quickly that there are exactly two types of revolvers in this world. There are the delicate, safe queens that look absolutely gorgeous sitting under glass. And then there are the unapologetic, indestructible juggernauts built specifically to survive the end of days. Ruger does not just manufacture firearms for the civilian market. They forge absolute battlefield tanks that just happen to fit inside a concealed carry holster. And the GP100 stands completely alone as the undisputed heavyweight champion of that rugged design philosophy. But do not let all that overbuilt, investment-cast steel trick you into thinking this is just some crude, blunt club. There is a massive amount of brilliant engineering pedigree baked directly into this platform. Most modern shooters out there have absolutely no clue that this legendary American iron actually shares genetic code with a sleek French law enforcement service pistol. Or the hilarious fact that Smith Wesson got so rattled by this gun's structural superiority, they literally funded a national marketing campaign comparing the Ruger frame to a fat, greasy hamburger patty. Oh yeah, we are diving deep into that piece of firearms history today. We are putting the GP100 under the microscope to see exactly what makes it tick. We are going to dissect precisely why this beast happily eats a relentless diet of full-house, scorching hot .357 Magnum loads for breakfast, while other competing revolvers slowly rattle themselves completely out of time. We are going to analyze the legendary triple-locking cylinder mechanism. We are looking closely at the continuous solid frame architecture, and we are going to break down exactly why this heavy metal masterpiece still commands absolute respect in a modern defensive landscape that is completely overrun by polymer, striker-fired Wonder Nines. If you appreciate this raw power of American steel, and you are not afraid of a little recoil, lock that slide to the rear and pay close attention. The Security 6 Blueprint. To really grasp the tactical DNA of the GP100, we have to rewind the clock and look at the godfather of the modern Ruger double-action family tree. Back in 1972, Ruger shocked the firearms market by dropping the Security 6. This was a massive, calculated shot across the bow, aimed directly at the established kings of the industry. At that specific time, you had the Smith Wesson Model 19, the stainless Model 66, and of course, the premium-priced Colt Python completely running the board in the law enforcement duty sector. The Security 6 was Ruger stepping directly up to the plate and declaring they could build a duty gun vastly stronger and significantly more affordable than anything the competition was pushing. Instead of relying on a fragile, traditional side plate like everyone else on the block, they utilized a solid, one-piece frame structure. It was incredibly rugged out of the box. So rugged, in fact, that it quickly earned its way into the duty holsters of the United States Border Patrol and countless local beat cops nationwide. Ruger even pushed the envelope early on, taking the risk of chambering some of these duty guns in 9mm, way back when the entire law enforcement world was strictly and stubbornly married to the .38 Special. But let us talk about the cold, hard reality of long-term range use. The Security 6 was an absolute workhorse of a firearm, but it still had a structural ceiling. It could handle standard .357 Magnum pressure, absolutely. However, running a constant, relentless volume of maximum pressure, fire-breathing Magnum loads would eventually accelerate the internal wear and tear on the action. The engineering team at Ruger knew that to permanently dethrone Smith & Wesson, a merely strong revolver was not going to cut it. They needed to engineer something fundamentally indestructible. The birth of the GP100. Fast forward to the early 1980s, and the developmental mission at Ruger headquarters became crystal clear. They needed to design and forge a full-size duty revolver strictly capable of absorbing an infinite number of high-velocity .357 Magnum rounds, without ever vibrating loose or losing its factory cylinder timing. By 1985, the GP100 officially hit the gun counter display glass, completely shifting the industry paradigm. They strategically reinforced every single stress point on the firearm. The main frame itself was thickened significantly to handle catastrophic pressure spikes. The top strap gained serious metallic mass to absolutely prevent any flexing under Magnum detonation, and they integrated a massive, full-length underlug right beneath the barrel. Let me tell you from experience, that heavy underlug is not just there to look aggressive for the cameras. That dense, forward-biased weight distribution is a crucial mechanical advantage that physically pins the muzzle down, actively fighting muzzle flip when you are dumping high-pressure defensive rounds under stress. Experienced shooters who transitioned straight from the older Security 6 recognized instantly that they were gripping an entirely different class of weapon. It felt incredibly substantial, anchoring itself firmly into the palm of your hand. Ruger also brilliantly retained their signature transfer bar safety mechanism. For modern everyday carry or backcountry defense, this specific feature is absolutely non-negotiable. You can safely pack this weapon with all 6 chambers completely loaded, accidentally drop it directly onto a concrete deck right on its hammer, and it will physically never discharge unless that trigger blade is deliberately pulled completely to the rear. When you combine that safety protocol with virtually unbreakable coil springs and a completely modular trigger housing unit, this was not just a catalog update. This was Ruger violently planting their flag and declaring absolute dominance in the tactical revolver market. The European law enforcement connection. Now, here is a fantastic piece of obscure tactical trivia you can pull out to win your next bet at the local gun shop counter. The rugged, blue-collar, all-American GP100 actually has a highly sophisticated European cousin. Back during the late 1970s, French national law enforcement agencies were actively hunting for a brand-new standard-issue duty sidearm. They absolutely adored the legendary performance of the Manurhin MR88. But let us be brutally honest. That particular revolver is painstakingly hand-fitted like a high-end Swiss watch, and it costs an absolute fortune to mass-produce for thousands of street cops. The French desperately needed a platform that was economically mass-producible without sacrificing 1 ounce of structural integrity. So, they reached out across the Atlantic Ocean and partnered directly with Ruger. The ultimate offspring of this international alliance was the Manurhin Special Police, which later successfully evolved into the MR88 series. It was essentially a tactical hybrid, heavily relying on rugged Ruger frame designs and internal mechanics, married directly to incredibly precise French-manufactured barrels and cylinders. While the French were busy refining that older Security 6 blueprint for European police work, Ruger pivoted in the exact opposite direction for the domestic United States civilian market. They decided to scale absolutely everything up. They fully leveraged their proprietary investment casting foundry process, pouring a massive, continuous block of solid steel that completely eliminated the astronomical machining costs typically associated with forged frames. So, while the French MR88 and the American GP100 technically share the exact same foundational engineering bloodline, the GP100 is the sibling that moved into the squat rack and started crushing protein shakes by the gallon. The triple locking cylinder system. Let us get deep into the mechanical weeds for a second and talk about cylinder lockup. You constantly hear the industry buzzword, triple locking cylinder, casually tossed around in online forums. But on the GP100, this specific mechanism is the absolute core of its legendary durability. The vast majority of standard revolvers on the commercial market only lock up at the rear of the cylinder and may be stabilized slightly at the forward tip of the ejector rod. Ruger engineers looked at those extreme Magnum chamber pressures and decided that traditional method was nowhere near acceptable for duty use. Instead, they engineered a robust system that solidly anchors the cylinder directly into the frame at 3 distinct reinforced points: the front, the rear, and the bottom of the assembly. This proprietary locking geometry ensures the cylinder remains in absolute dead center alignment with the forcing cone, whether it is your very first shot or your 5,000th trigger pull. Now, if you go to the counter, physically pick one of these up and give the cylinder a slight twist with your fingers, you are going to feel a tiny, microscopic amount of rotational play. Do not let that spook you into thinking the gun is broken. That is not sloppy machining. That is an intentional, highly brilliant design feature. Ruger purposely built in a marginal degree of mechanical float. This intentionally allows the bullet to perfectly center and align itself naturally as it violently bridges the cylinder gap and slams directly into the barrel rifling. It is a brilliant, self-correcting mechanical system that massively, drastically enhances long-term reliability in austere environments. Unlike the incredibly tight bank vault lockup of a vintage Colt that demands meticulous hand-fitting and constant gunsmith attention, the Ruger system is specifically designed to keep running flawlessly, even when the action gets heavily packed with carbon buildup or screaming hot from rapid-fire defensive drills. It is the exact reason you can cycle thousands of rounds of the absolute spiciest defensive ammunition without ever suffering a catastrophic timing failure. The great Hamburger War and structural integrity. If you want to fundamentally understand the biggest anatomical difference between a Ruger and a Smith & Wesson, you have to look directly at the underlying frame architecture. Smith & Wesson utilizes a traditional, old-school side plate design. They physically machine a large opening right into the side of the receiver to install the internal lockwork, and then cap it off with a fitted metal plate held in by tiny screws. Ruger looked at that structural compromise and gave it a hard, immediate pass. The frame of the GP100 is one solid, uninterrupted, continuous loop of hardened steel. By totally eliminating the side plate entirely, Ruger successfully removed the primary weak point where a revolver frame could theoretically stretch, warp, or permanently flex under catastrophic internal Magnum pressures. Ruger was incredibly proud of this massive engineering advantage, and they actively bragged about their continuous frame superiority in their national print advertisements. Smith & Wesson actually got highly defensive about this, clapping back with a famous, slightly petty ad campaign that prominently featured a massive, greasy hamburger patty. They were basically insulting the Ruger design team, publicly calling their cast frame inherently fat, bulky, and completely overweight. Smith argued aggressively that their traditionally forged frames were inherently strong enough to handle Magnums without needing to carry all that extra dimensional mass. And look, I will be the absolute first guy to admit that a Smith & Wesson Model 686 is a remarkably sleek, beautifully well-balanced machine on the range. But the Ruger blueprint holds a massive, undeniable real-world advantage when it comes to austere field maintenance. Because there is zero side plate to mess with, you can literally drop the entire trigger guard and fire control assembly straight out of the bottom of the gun in one solid piece. You absolutely do not need a specialized set of delicate gunsmithing screwdrivers, a perfectly clean workbench, and a silent prayer just to properly clean out the internal guts after a hard training day. It is highly modular, it is brutally simple to maintain, and it is fundamentally built tougher than a coffin nail. The ingenuity of the grip peg. Another stroke of absolute engineering genius that often goes completely ignored by casual shooters is Ruger's brilliant grip peg system. If you closely examine traditional revolvers, they rely heavily on a fully outlined metal grip frame, or backstrap, that permanently dictates the physical size and shape of your handle. If you happen to have remarkably small hands, or you happen to have massive, oversized bear paws, you are entirely restricted by the physical dimensions of that unforgiving steel outline. Ruger completely threw that entire antiquated concept out the window and replaced the traditional grip frame with a single, incredibly sturdy steel peg extending straight downward from the main receiver. This inherently changes the ergonomic game completely, because the aftermarket grip itself now determines the overall profile, not the underlying metal frame. You can easily slide on a minimalist, low-profile rubber grip to absolutely maximize concealment under a light cover garment. Or you can bolt on a massive, oversized chunk of checkered target wood for absolute recoil control during long, heavy-hitting range sessions. Because there is significantly more shock-absorbing material physically located between the web of your hand and the hard steel, it drastically mitigates the felt recoil impulse traveling up your arm. Furthermore, replacing a massive full steel grip frame with a condensed peg leaves vastly more metallic material heavily concentrated up in the main body of the receiver itself, drastically reinforcing the critical stress zones near the cylinder. It is just one more perfect example of the engineering team prioritizing absolute combat function over traditional aesthetic form. Far beyond the Magnum. While the legendary .357 Magnum will always be the absolute bread and butter of this tactical platform, the GP100 has successfully evolved into an incredibly versatile weapon system over the decades. Ruger has successfully chambered this absolute tank in just about every single practical caliber you can possibly imagine running. You can easily track down a specialized model chambered in the highly underrated .327 Federal Magnum. That specific configuration gives you an extremely potent 7-shot payload instead of the standard 6, making it a seriously impressive sleeper choice for everyday defensive carry. For the hardcore old-school big-bore traditionalists, they manufacture a heavy-hitting 5-shot configuration in .44 Special that hits like an absolute freight train. They even push out a massively fun, incredibly heavy 10-shot 22 long rifle variant, which I would confidently argue is the absolute premier recoil-free training tool for mastering double-action trigger control. And for all my die-hard semi-auto tactical guys out there, Ruger absolutely did not forget about you. There is a dedicated, heavy-duty 10mm auto version of this exact platform. It intelligently utilizes specialized full moon clips to securely hold those rimless auto-loading cartridges tightly in the cylinder. If you are already stockpiling massive amounts of 10mm ammunition for your backcountry Glock, or your customized 1911, adding this wheel gun to the safe makes absolute perfect logistical sense. The grossly overbuilt, raw strength of the GP100 action effortlessly absorbs the violent, snappy pressure curve of full-power 10mm defensive loads without breaking a single drop of sweat. The final verdict on the firing line. Let us just be brutally, 100% honest about the visual aesthetics for a second here. The GP100 is a highly polarizing piece of defensive hardware. It is unapologetically blocky. It proudly sports that massive, aggressive underlug and a top strap thick enough to legally use as a framing hammer on a construction site. It completely lacks the delicate, sweeping, elegant lines of a vintage Python or the classic streamlined profile of a traditional K-frame duty gun. There are plenty of historical purists out there who firmly believe it looks exactly like a heavy cinder block with a trigger temporarily attached to it. But other dedicated shooters, and I firmly include my own experiences in this specific camp, look at it and immediately see a dedicated, life-saving tool that means absolute, undeniable business. Ruger deliberately maintains some of those rugged, gritty service revolver tactical vibes straight from the 1970s, and those iconic, original rubber grips with the inset wood panels remain a highly debated, love it or hate it, ergonomic feature to this very day. But here is the absolute bottom line when you are standing out on the firing range running hot drills. This firearm was never, ever designed to sit comfortably inside a climate-controlled glass display case at a museum. It was engineered from the ground up to go straight to work. It was fundamentally built to ride incredibly hard inside and outside the waistband holster, strapped tightly to a hip, enduring freezing rain, thick mud, and severe physical abuse. It was precisely manufactured to reliably protect your life and the lives of your family when the chips are totally down and the violent fight actually comes to your front door. And in that unforgiving, high-stakes tactical environment, being pretty absolutely does not matter in the slightest. Flawless, unstoppable ballistic performance is the only metric that counts. If you guys got some solid practical value out of this deep dive into American-forged steel, do me a massive favor to keep the channel running. Smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss a gear review, and be absolutely sure to leave a comment down below. I want to know exactly where you stand on the firing line today. Are you running heavily with Team Ruger, Or are you backing the heritage of Team Smith and Wesson? Drop your raw thoughts in the comments section. I want to read all about it. Until next time, check your gear, stay incredibly safe, and keep shooting.